Bedtime Biographies. Genghis Khan. It is 1162 somewhere on the Mongolian steppe. The world does not yet know this name. A boy is born into a tent, into wind, into the vast grass that stretches beyond knowing. His father Yeske is a chieftain of modest power. His mother Helm holds him close in the cold. They call him Temujin. He will not stay small. Around this cradle, the steppe tribes are scattered like stars that have forgotten how to align. Men fight men. Loyalties fracture. No one imagines that this child, born into such ordinary danger, will gather them all. But first, he will lose everything. His father will die when he is still a boy. His family will be cast out, abandoned to hunger, and in that abandonment, something will kindle in him. A hunger not for food, but for connection, for loyalty, for a world remade. Tonight, on Bedtime Biographies, we follow Temujin's journey from the edge of nothing to the throne of an empire. We meet the men who shaped him, Jamuka, Togrul, his beloved Bruti, and watch as he transforms the chaos of the steppe into something the world has never seen. A rise, a betrayal, a conquest that changed everything. You can let yourself drift now. Dim the lights if you like. Get comfortable. It is perfectly fine to fall asleep before this story ends. But first, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Let us begin where all lives begin. In the grass, in the dark, with a boy who was about to remake the world. Born into hardship. Chapter 1. Born into hardship, the year of his birth was uncertain, even to those who knew him. Some who kept the old records said he came into the world in 1155. Others insisted it was 1162 or 1167, the year of the pig, though which pig's year among the cycling animals remained a matter of disagreement among the chroniclers, who would later attempt to fix his life in time. The boy himself, it is said, may never have known the true date of his arrival. Such was the nature of the world he was born into, a world without the careful marking of days, where memory and tradition moved like wind across the steppe, shifting and uncertain. He was born with a name that meant something like iron, or possibly victory, Temujin, though even this simple fact contained within it competing stories. His father, Yeske, claimed that he had just returned from a successful campaign against the Tatars when the boy arrived, and he named the child after a captive from that very battle, Temujin, whose capture he had wished to commemorate. Yet others said the name came from the root tema, the word for iron itself, speaking to some quality the father perceived in his newborn son. The truth, as is often the way with such origins, lay somewhere in the mist between these tellings, knowable perhaps only to those long dead who had witnessed the moment. What is certain is that Temujin entered the world as the eldest child of Yeske, a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man whose lineage was said to trace back to the legendary Bodoncha Munkarg, a warlord whose deeds had settled themselves into the memory of the peoples of the steppe. His mother was Helm, originally of the Olkanud clan, a woman whom Yeske had taken from her first betrothed, a man named Chiladu of the Merkits. This act of abduction, a common enough occurrence among the tribes, would cast a long shadow across Temujin's early years. The Merkits did not forget such things. They carried their grudges as carefully as they carried their herds across the grasslands. And one day, years hence, they would come seeking a reckoning. The boy was born near the Onon River, or so the secret history recorded, at a place called Delm Boldog, though even this location was disputed by later historians who could not agree whether it lay at Dadal in Kenti province or somewhere farther south in the lands the Russians would one day call Agin Buryat Okrug. But wherever the precise spot on that great river, it was there that Temujin drew his first breath and entered a world of vast open grasslands, where the sky dominated all things and a man's worth was measured by his ability to ride, to shoot, and to command respect among his kinsmen. There were legends told of his birth, the kind of stories that grow around men who would later become great. It was said that he came into the world clutching a blood clot in his small hand, a sign in the old stories that he was destined to be a warrior. That blood and battle were already written into his nature before he could even walk. Another tale held that Helm had been visited by a ray of light that foretold his coming, much as the legendary Alan Gua, the mythical ancestor of the Borjigin themselves, had conceived her sons in such mysterious fashion. These legends, whether true or merely the work of those who shaped his story after his greatness became undeniable, spoke to something people sensed in him even then, though perhaps they had only sensed it afterward, looking back. In the household of Yeske, Temujin was surrounded by family. His mother bore him 3 younger brothers in turn, Kasar, Hakian, and Temge, and a daughter named Temlin. From Yeske's secondary wife Sokigel came 2 half-brothers, Beta and Belguti, though the identity of Sokigel herself has been lost to the uncertain records. All of these children grew together at Yeske's main camp on the banks of the Onon, where the Borjigin kept their herds and their homes. It was there that Temujin and his brothers learned what all stepchildren learned, how to sit astride a horse as if horse and rider were a single creature, how to draw a bow with the strength that hunting and necessity would gradually instill in their young muscles. These were not skills taught in any formal sense. They were absorbed through watching and doing, through the daily rhythms of a life intimately bound to horsemanship and movement across open land. When Temujin had reached 8 years of age, his father began to think of the future that awaited his eldest son. Yeske, being a man of some standing and vision, understood that a boy of good birth and promising character should be betrothed early to secure advantageous alliances. He decided to seek a bride for his heir from among the Ongirat tribe, a people of considerable prestige in the steppe world, who had intermarried with the Mongols on numerous occasions, and whose blood therefore ran in the veins of many Borjigin women. Yeske took the boy from his camp and rode with him to the pastures where the Ongirats grazed their herds, and there he spoke with an Ongirat chieftain named Day Session. The negotiations that followed were between men accustomed to the careful weighing of advantages and obligations. Day Session had a daughter, Bertie, and Yeske proposed that she be betrothed to Temujin. The match pleased Day Session, for a union with the son of a Borjigin chieftain brought prestige and the promise of alliance. Yet Day Session understood his own position and held the advantage in these negotiations. The bride price that such a match would command was substantial, and rather than accept payment directly, Day Session made a proposition. Let the boy remain in his household. Let Temujin work off his future debt through service. It was a shrewd move, one that would bind the young man to him and ensure that the obligations flowed both directions before the marriage was even formalized. Yeske accepted these terms. He had secured a powerful ally and a good match for his son, and he departed the Ongirat pastures satisfied. On his way home, riding alone, he encountered a band of Tatars on the steppe. Following the ancient tradition of hospitality that governed the tribes, Yeske approached them and requested a meal. But the Tatars were not moved by the bonds of custom. They recognized in Yeske an old enemy, and into the food they prepared for him, they slipped poison. The death that followed was slow. Yeske sickened gradually as he rode homeward, his body weakening with each passing hour. When he reached his camp, already close to death, he called for a trusted retainer named Munglig and gave him a single, urgent command: go and retrieve Temjin from the Ongirut. The boy was still there, serving his future father-in-law, learning what it meant to live in another man's household. Munglig set out at once, but he was too late to save his master. Yeske died before his son could return to him, before father and child could speak one final time. The death of a Khan's marks a moment of fracture in the life of his people. The unity that a strong leader weaves among disparate groups and ambitions is not a natural thing. It requires constant tending, constant assertion. When Yeske fell, that unity broke like ice beneath the spring sun. His people, which included members of the Borjigin, the Taikyud, and other clans, no longer had a single voice to follow. The question of succession hung heavy in the air. Temjin was only 9 or 10 years old when his father died. Beta, his older half-brother, was perhaps 12. Neither was old enough to command the respect of experienced warriors and leaders. Neither had yet grown into manhood. The Taikyud faction, perhaps seeing in the widow Hilm and her young sons a weakness to exploit, made their first move. The records of what happened next do not all agree. The secret history, that ancient Mongolian text of uncertain reliability, but not without its worth, tells that the Taikyuds excluded Helm from the ancestor worship ceremonies that followed her husband's death, ceremonies that were central to the life of the clan. The text recounts that when the ceremonies were concluded and the proper observances made, the Taikyuds simply abandoned the camp. The secret history goes further, claiming that the entire Borjigin clan followed in their departure, that all the people who had ridden under Yeske's banner turned away from his widow, that Helm appealed to their honor and shame, begging them to stay, but that her words fell on ears already turned toward better prospects and more certain fortunes. Yet other sources, particularly Rashid al-Din and the Shengwu Qinjing Lu, suggest a different narrative. They imply that Yeske's brothers stood by the widow, that the split was not so absolute. It is possible that Helm refused to enter into levirate marriage with one of her husband's brothers, a practice permitted under steppe law, and that this refusal caused the tensions that later separated her from her husband's clan. Or perhaps the author of the secret history, writing with his own purposes in mind, simply dramatized the abandonment, crafted from the memory of hardship a story of complete desolation. What all sources agree upon is this: most of Yeske's people renounced his family. They turned their backs on Helm and her children and chose instead to follow the Taikyuds toward what they believed would be a more secure future. The widow was left nearly alone, stripped of the protection and status that her husband's position had once granted her. The life that had been hers, the life of a chieftain's wife, with servants and comfort and the security of belonging to a great clan, fell away. In its place came a life of hardship, so complete that it stripped away everything but the bare essentials of survival. Helm gathered her children and adapted. She and her sons and daughter took up the hunter-gatherer's life, moving with the seasons, following the resources that the steppe and forest offered to those desperate enough to search for them. They collected the roots and nuts that grew in the wild places, hunted the small animals that crossed their path, and caught fish from the rivers and streams. It was a life far removed from the one they had known, a life of constant labor and uncertainty. Yet Hailn did what mothers do. She kept her children alive. She taught them to survive in a world that had suddenly become hostile, that had withdrawn its protection. It was during these years of reduced circumstances that the character of the boy Temujin began to reveal itself. He was not content to accept the diminishment of his family's status. Even as a child, even as he worked to help gather food and survive the seasons, something in him resisted the invisibility that poverty imposed. The records speak of his charisma, that mysterious quality that causes other people to be drawn toward a person, to wish to serve them or follow them into uncertain futures. But charisma is not born in comfort. It is often forged in hardship, in the moments when a person must rely entirely on their own will and the strength of their personality to survive. Of the Khairite, after the Khan had been temporarily deposed by rivals within his tribe, Togrul's gratitude was substantial, and he reaffirmed his support for his young vassal. These early successes, modest though they were, restored Temujin's standing among the steppe tribes and signaled that he had not been permanently diminished by his defeat at Dalan Baljut. Yet the path forward remained fraught with danger. The tribal confederations of the Mongol plateau were intricate webs of shifting allegiances, bound together by kinship, obligation, and the personal authority of individual leaders. A man could rise swiftly through demonstrated prowess, cunning, and the ability to attract followers, but he could fall just as quickly if he lost the confidence of his supporters, or if a rival leader proved more compelling. Temujin understood this vulnerability. He had tasted humiliation, had experienced the precarity of power, and had learned that survival on the steppe required more than martial skill alone. It demanded an acute sensitivity to the desires and fears of those around him, a willingness to reward loyalty generously, and an unforgiving response to betrayal. In the years following his re-emergence, Temujin methodically set about consolidating his position. He gathered around him men of talent and proven capability, binding them to himself through a combination of rewards, kinship ties, and the mystique of his personality. His shamans continued to proclaim that heaven had marked him for greatness, a message that resonated powerfully among people who lived in constant uncertainty and sought assurance that their fortunes were inscribed in the cosmos itself. Temujin encouraged this belief without necessarily claiming it as his own conviction, understanding its utility in cementing the loyalty of his followers. The relationship between Temujin and Jamuka, meanwhile, had become increasingly strained. What had once been a bond of brotherhood had curdled into rivalry, then into open enmity. The two men represented competing visions for the future of the steppe peoples. Jamuka gathered around him the major tribal rulers, the aristocratic elite who had dominated the plateau for generations. These were men accustomed to power, suspicious of innovation, and protective of their hereditary rights. Temujin, by contrast, was building something radically different, a following based not primarily on tribal affiliation or aristocratic birth, but on personal loyalty to himself and on the promise of a more stable, more prosperous order. He welcomed men of humble origin if they demonstrated ability and unwavering commitment. He elevated capable followers regardless of their clan background, a revolutionary departure from the tribal hierarchies that had long governed steppe society. This fundamental difference in approach made conflict inevitable. By the early 1200s, tensions that had been simmering for years erupted into open warfare. The sources offer somewhat conflicting accounts of the precise sequence of events, but they agree on the essential narrative. Temujin and Jamuka clashed repeatedly, their followers engaging in raids and counter-raids that devastated the steppe. These were not pitched battles in the conventional sense, but rather a series of violent confrontations interspersed with periods of uneasy truce. In 1202, Temujin launched a campaign against the Tatars, the very tribe whose ancestors had poisoned his father decades earlier. The Tatars had remained a threat to Temujin's growing power, and he moved decisively against them. According to the sources, he utterly annihilated the Tatars as a people, effectively erasing them from the tribal landscape of the steppe. This act was brutal by any standard, but it was also deeply symbolic. Temujin was demonstrating that he would not tolerate rivals, that he possessed the will to inflict total destruction on those who stood in his way, and that his memory was long enough to encompass vengeance for wrongs committed a generation earlier. Around the same time, Temujin took action against the Kerit, the very tribe whose Khan Togrul had been his patron and protector. The sources suggest that Togrul had begun to view Temujin as a threat, a dangerous vassal who had grown too powerful and too ambitious. In 1203, Togrul launched a surprise attack on Temujin, attempting to eliminate him before he could grow any stronger. The assault caught Temujin off guard, and he suffered a serious defeat. For a moment, it seemed as though his rising fortunes might be reversed, that he would be destroyed by the very man who had once taken him under his protection. But Temujin proved resilient. He regrouped his forces, gathered his scattered followers, and launched a counterattack against Togrul. The sources indicate that Temujin's response was both swift and overwhelming. He defeated Togrul decisively, and the aging Khan did not survive his defeat. With the death of Togrul and the destruction of the Kerit as an independent power, a major obstacle to Temujin's dominance had been removed. Yet Jamuka remained, and he remained formidable. The two rivals continued their struggle for supremacy across the steppe, and the conflict between them came to embody the central tension of the age, the old order, represented by Jamuka and the traditional tribal aristocracy, arrayed against the new order that Temujin was building, based on meritocracy and personal loyalty rather than hereditary privilege. Other tribes became drawn into this larger conflict, forced to choose sides or be destroyed. The Naiman tribe, one of the most powerful on the steppe, eventually lined up against Temujin, viewing him as an existential threat to their way of life. The final confrontation came in 1204, when Temujin defeated the Naiman tribe decisively. This victory effectively decided the long struggle for dominance. With the Naiman subdued and Jamuka's coalition crumbling, Temujin moved to consolidate his position. He hunted down Jamuka himself, and according to the sources, executed him, thereby eliminating the last significant rival to his authority. Some accounts suggest that Jamuka was executed by strangulation, a method reserved for men of noble birth, as it avoided the spilling of blood, a detail that speaks to the complex rituals and codes that governed even the violence of this tumultuous period. By 1206, after nearly 2 decades of campaigns, betrayals, alliances, and reconsolidations, Temujin stood alone as the supreme power on the Mongolian steppe. No other leader could challenge him. No other confederation could match his forces or his authority. He had done what no one before him had accomplished. He had united the fractious, quarreling tribes of the steppe under a single rule: the pastoral nomads who had spent centuries raiding one another, feuding over pasture land and stolen horses, harassing merchants and disrupting the settled lands on their borders, had finally been brought under unified command. The Rise to Power. Chapter 2. The Rise to Power. By 1206, after nearly 2 decades of campaigns, betrayals, alliances, and reconsolidations, Temujin stood alone as the supreme power on the Mongolian steppe. No other leader could challenge him. No other confederation could match his forces or his authority. He had done what no one before him had accomplished. He had united the fractious, quarreling tribes of the steppe under a single rule. The pastoral nomads who had spent centuries raiding one another, feuding over pastureland and stolen horses, harassing merchants and disrupting the settled lands on their borders, had finally been brought under unified command. Yet this moment of solitary authority had not emerged from ambition alone. It had been woven, thread by thread, from the patient loyalty of those who stood beside him, from the men who had chosen to follow when they might have fled, who had sheltered him when he was hunted, who had bled beside him when victory was far from certain. In the slow accumulation of these relationships lay the true architecture of his power. Temujin's path to dominion had begun not in glory, but in deprivation, shaped by those closest to him who taught him both kindness and necessity. After his father Yeske's death, the boy had been left vulnerable. His family cast adrift from the protection that tribal structure ordinarily provided. The Taikyud faction had moved swiftly to strip away Yeske's widow and her children of their standing. Helm, his mother, was excluded from the ancestor worship ceremonies that bound the living to the honored dead, and one by one, the relatives and followers of the deceased Khan turned away. The accounts vary in their telling. Some sources suggest that Yeske's brothers maintained their support, while others speak of a more complete abandonment, but all agree on the essential fact: the family's resources dwindled, and Helm was forced to gather her children and survive by means far removed from the dignity of her former station. They took up a hunter-gatherer's life, collecting roots and nuts from the sparse earth, hunting small animals when the steppe provided them, catching fish from rivers where they could. It was a harsh descent, but it was in these years of hunger and precariousness that the boy learned to observe, to calculate, and to value those who acted with integrity when they had no obligation to do so. Among those who crossed Temujin's path in his years of vulnerability, one man's quiet compassion would remain embedded in memory. Sorkin Shura was a simple man who had seen the boy hiding in the Onon River after his escape from Taikyud captivity, and rather than raise the alarm, as custom and perhaps self-interest might have urged him to do, Sorkin Shura had hidden the fugitive in his tent for 3 days, at considerable personal risk. Those 3 days of shelter, of food provided in darkness, of safety offered without fanfare, had marked something in Temujin's understanding of human nature. A man's true measure, he would seem to have learned, lay not in his rank or his tribe, but in what he chose to do when no one watched, when the cost might be high. As the young man grew, other figures appeared to steady his ascent. Borshu came to him as a youth, offering not grand pronouncements but practical aid, helping to retrieve horses that had been stolen, demonstrating through action rather than words what loyalty might mean. When Borshu joined Temujin's camp as his first Nkor, his personal companion, he became the first of many who would cleave to this rising leader, not from fear or duty, but from a sense that something in Temujin's character called forth their better selves. The secret history in recording these early incidents of personal loyalty seems to emphasize a quality in Temujin that transcended the usual claims of birth or tribal affiliation, a form of charisma that worked not through spectacle or domination, but through a kind of moral clarity that men sensed in him, even when he was least powerful. When Temujin reached his 15th year and returned to Day Second to claim his betrothed wife Berte, he carried with him both the vulnerability of his youth and the hardened judgment of one who had learned to read men carefully. Day Second, who had feared the boy was dead, received him with warmth and relief. The marriage took place with blessing, and Day Second accompanied the newlyweds back to Temujin's camp, a gesture of dynastic hope. Brutus' mother, Otan, presented Helm with an expensive sable cloak, a gift both generous and symbolically significant, an acknowledgement that the widow's son had worth, that family bonds might be honored despite the reversals of fortune. But Temujin, though young, understood that material wealth alone did not secure position on the steppe. A gift, however fine, required a recipient worthy of it. He chose to re-gift the cloak to Togrul, the Khan of the Karait tribe. Togrul was not a stranger to Temujin's family. Years before, the great Karait ruler had fought alongside Yeske and sworn with him the Anda Pact, that sacred oath of blood brotherhood that bound two men with bonds that transcended ordinary kinship. In making this offering to Togrul, Temujin was doing more than seeking patronage. He was reaching across the interval of his father's death to claim a connection that had been consecrated in his father's lifetime. He was reminding Togrul of a debt that lay not in material exchange, but in the memory of loyalty sworn. Togrul received the gift with delight. The Khan of the Karait ruled vast territories in central Mongolia, and though his authority was considerable, it was also insecure. He distrusted many of his followers, and trusted men were difficult to find. A young man of evident lineage, bearing a gift of value and carrying with him the memory of a blood oath sworn to his deceased father, this seemed to Togrul to be precisely what he needed. He welcomed Temujin into his protection, and something like warmth kindled between patron and client. The two grew close, as men sometimes do when they recognize in each other a hunger for loyalty that matches their own. Incods such as Jelmi entered into Temujin's service, and his following began to take shape, not yet large, not yet powerful, but growing in the way that small fires grow when tended patiently. Around this time, Temujin and Berti had their first child, a daughter named Koji. The arrival of a child anchored Temujin to a larger future. He was no longer merely a man surviving, but a father, someone responsible for continuation. Yet his newfound stability was short-lived. The debts of history, it seemed, had not yet been fully settled. The Merkits, remembering that Yeske had abducted Helm from their tribe years before, sought compensation not through negotiation, but through the same means by which they had originally been wronged. Around 300 Merkits raided Temujin's camp, seeking to reverse the old abduction by taking Berti in return. Temujin and his brothers were able to escape to Burkhan Khaldun mountain, that sacred height to which men fled in times of extremity. But Berti and Xochitl, Temujin's sister, were taken. The loss was not merely personal, it was a violation of the order that had just begun to form. In accordance with the customs of the steppe, Berti was given in marriage to the younger brother of the now deceased Chiladu, a Merkit who had his own claims upon her. She would bear a child in captivity, a son to whom Temujin would give his name and his household, though the whisper of uncertain paternity would follow the boy through all his days. The sources differ in how they recounted this episode. The secret history, the oldest account, preserves the full weight of the ambiguity, while later historians like Rashid al-Din sought to protect the family's reputation by smoothing away any hint of illegitimacy. Yet Temujin himself seemed never to deny Jochi, never to cast him out, despite the doubt that clung to the child's origins. Perhaps he understood, in ways that later chroniclers did not, that loyalty to those bound to you by circumstance and love might transcend the accidents of blood. Temujin's response to the abduction was to appeal for aid to two men, Togrul, his patron, and Jamuka, his childhood Anda, the friend with whom he had exchanged knucklebones and arrows in the simplicity of youth, and with whom he had sworn the blood oath of brotherhood at 11 years old. Jamuka had risen considerably in the years since their childhood bond. He had become chief of the Jadaran tribe, a leader of note in his own right. Both Togrul and Jamuka were willing to field armies of 20,000 warriors, and with Jamuka in command of the joint force, the campaign against the Merkits was mounted and soon won. Bertie was recovered, now pregnant, and she soon gave birth to Jochi. What followed was a period of extraordinary closeness between Temujin and Jamuka. For a year and a half, the followers of both men camped together, their leaders reforging their childhood Anda pact. According to the secret history, they slept together under one blanket, the intimacy of old friends who had been separated and now discovered one another anew. The narrative presents this as a time of genuine affection, though some later historians have wondered whether something more complex transpired, whether Temujin may have actually entered into Jamuka's service in exchange for the assistance with the Merkits, a subordination that would have been customary, though the sources do not clearly state it. Yet even in the warmth of reunion, tensions began to form. Jamuka made some remark. The secret history records it only cryptically, in a tone suggesting offense taken, about the way the two camps should be positioned, and the remark caused Temujin to recognize that the old friendship, however real, could not sustain the diverging ambitions of two men, both born to lead. Temujin consulted with those closest to him, his mother Helm and his wife Berthe, both of whom had learned through hardship to see clearly into the hearts of men. They advised him to break away, to build an independent following. The major tribal rulers remained loyal to Jamuka, but 41 lesser leaders gave their support to Temujin, along with many commoners. These included Subutai and others of the Uriankai, the Barulas, the Olkanids, and many more, men drawn from tribes and families that had previously counted for little in the steppes hierarchy. What drew these men to follow Temujin rather than Jamuka? The sources speak of his reputation as a fair and generous lord, one who could offer better lives to those who served him. His shamans prophesied that heaven itself, that vast and inscrutable force that governed the steppe, had allocated him a great destiny. But perhaps more decisive was something simpler. These were men who had seen him shelter his vulnerability without becoming small, who had watched him honor those who honored him, who recognized in him an unusual quality of attention. He did not merely use men, he seemed to see them, to understand what they had given up in choosing to follow him. Temujin was soon acclaimed by his close followers as Khan of the Mongols. Togrul was pleased to see his proch elevated to such a rank. It did not diminish the patron's authority, but rather extended it. Jamuka, however, was resentful. The childhood Anda had become a rival, and the easy warmth of reunion curdled into the cold calculus of competition. Tensions escalated into open hostility, and in approximately 1187, the two leaders clashed in battle at Dalan Baljut, a place whose name would live in memory. The forces were evenly matched, and history records only that one side suffered a clear defeat. Different chroniclers would later claim different outcomes. Some, like Rashid al-Din, insisted that Temujin was victorious, though their accounts contradicted both themselves and one another, the way that troubled victories are sometimes obscured by those who wish to reshape the past. What happened next exists in a kind of shadow in the records. Modern historians, examining the long silence between the defeat or unclear outcome at Dalan Baljit and Tenjin's re-emergence around 1195 as a man of considerable power, have come to believe that much of that lost decade was spent far from the steppe. It is said that Tenjin took refuge across the border, seeking service with the Jurchen Jin dynasty in North China. Zhao Hong, a Jin official, recorded that the future Genghis Khan spent several years as a slave of the Jin. This revelation was once dismissed as the nationalist arrogance of a Chinese chronicler, but scholars have come to see it differently. No other source adequately explains where Tenjin was, or how he accumulated the resources and connections that would enable his later resurgence. It was a common enough practice for disaffected steppe leaders to seek temporary refuge and advancement in the service of settled powers, just as disgraced Chinese officials sometimes fled to the steppe. What mattered was that Temujin, when he re-emerged, had retained significant power, which suggested that he had profited from his time in Jin service. Yet such an episode, detrimental to Mongol prestige, was a detail that the sources assembled by his successors would carefully omit. Only Zhao Hong, bound by no such taboos, spoke it plainly. In the early summer of 1196, Temujin participated in a joint campaign with the Jin against the Tatars, a people who had begun to act contrary to Jin interests. It was a campaign that required him to work alongside foreign soldiers to prove his worth to masters of a different order. As a reward, the Jin awarded him the honorific title Chaut Kuri, which probably meant something akin to commander of hundreds in the Jurchen tongue. It was not a grandiose title, but it was a recognition, and recognition was precisely what Tenjin needed to rebuild his standing on the steppe. At around the same time, he assisted Togrul with a matter of great importance to the Keriot Khan. Togrul's lordship of the Keriot had been usurped by one of his own relatives, a kinsman who had the support of the powerful Naiman tribe, a tribe that would prove, in time, to be among the most formidable obstacles to Temujin's ultimate ambitions. Yet through Temujin's aid, Togrul was able to reclaim his position. These actions of 1196 fundamentally altered the balance of power on the steppe, though Temujin remained nominally Togrul's vassal, and this nominal subordination he would maintain for some years. He had become de facto an equal ally, a man whose counsel was sought, whose strength was respected. Jamuka, meanwhile, had behaved with calculated cruelty. In the aftermath of his victory at Dalan Baljit, he had allegedly boiled 70 prisoners alive in great cauldrons, and he had humiliated the corpses of leaders who had opposed him, refusing them the dignities that even defeated enemies ordinarily received. It was the kind of violence that sowed fear, yes, but it also sowed resentment. Those who had followed Jamuka began to reconsider their allegiance. A number of disaffected followers, including men like Munglig, who had once served Yeske and then defected to Temujin, turned toward the rising Khan. They were drawn not merely by fear of Jamuka's cruelty, but by Temujin's newfound wealth and the suggestion that better lives awaited those who cast their lot with him. Temujin, in his consolidation of power, did not hesitate to strike at those who offered resistance. He subdued the Jurchen tribe, a people who had previously offended him at a feast, by refusing to participate in the Tatar campaign after executing their leaders, a harsh but not uncommon response to defiance. He had his brother Belguti symbolically break a leading Jurchen's back in a staged wrestling match, a ritualized humiliation performed in retribution. This latter incident troubled even the author of The Secret History, who noted it with evident disapproval, observing that it contravened the accepted customs of Mongol justice. It was a detail that revealed something important about Temujin. He was willing, when he judged it necessary, to depart from the codes that governed even the violent society of the steppe, to impose a discipline that was harsher, more thorough than tradition dictated. These actions occurred around 1197, in the years following his re-emergence. The Tatar forest peoples, the forest-dwelling Merkits, and other groups were brought under Mongol authority through campaigns that were sometimes peacefully negotiated and sometimes violently imposed. In the south, Genghis subdued the Tatars more thoroughly, executing those leaders who had not already fallen and integrating the survivors into his forces. The campaigns of these years were methodical rather than spectacular, aimed at ensuring that no rival power could emerge to challenge his authority. It was during this period of consolidation that Genghis Khan began to develop the administrative and military infrastructure that would eventually enable him to conquer an empire spanning from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. The decimal system he had established proved its worth as a mechanism for control and coordination. Commanders appointed on the basis of merit rather than birth proved more flexible and innovative than the traditional tribal leaders they replaced. The Kashik, expanded to 10,000 men, functioned as both a filter for talent and a mechanism of control, ensuring that the most capable warriors were constantly under the Khan's observation and available for deployment wherever they were needed most. The question of succession occupied Genghis Khan's mind during these years. His 4 sons by Brite, Jochi, Chagatai, Gede, and Tolui represented the future of his dynasty. The ambiguity surrounding Jochi's paternity did not prevent him from being acknowledged as Genghis's son, though it would complicate matters of succession and inheritance in later years. Chagatai, born after Berti's rescue, was unambiguously of Genghis Khan's blood and would be known for his strict adherence to the Mongol customs and laws. Gede, despite his serious wounding during the retreat to Baljuna, recovered and showed promise as a capable administrator. Tolui, the youngest, benefited from advantageous marriages that Genghis arranged, including unions with the captured Kerit princesses, strengthening the Khan's position through strategic family alliances. Beyond the immediate family, Genghis Khan cultivated relationships with his most trusted followers through a combination of generosity and demonstrated loyalty. Those who had stood with him at Baljuna were never forgotten, and their descendants would occupy positions of considerable importance throughout the empire. Borshu, who had been among the first to join him and had lost his horse during the desperate retreat, remained one of his most valued commanders. Mukhali, given command of the left wing of the army, proved to be an exceptionally capable general whose loyalty to Genghis Khan was absolute and whose strategic vision complemented the Khan's own ambitions. The integration of conquered peoples into the Mongol state proceeded according to principles that would become characteristic of Genghis Khan's reign. Talented individuals from subject tribes were incorporated into the military hierarchy based on demonstrated ability rather than birth. This practice, which contravened the traditional aristocratic assumptions of the steppe, proved remarkably effective in binding disparate groups to the Khan's person and in creating a military force whose effectiveness transcended tribal affiliations. Men who might have remained enemies within the old tribal system became brothers in arms in the decimal units, sharing hardship and danger, rewarded or punished collectively based on their unit's performance. During these years of consolidation, Genghis Khan also began to establish the first formal codes and regulations that would govern the expanding Mongol state. These regulations, which would eventually be codified into what became known as the Yasa, addressed practical matters of military discipline, the treatment of captives, the organization of the hunt, and the proper conduct of officials. The Yasa was not written down in these early years. It emerged gradually from the Khan's pronouncements and decisions, but it represented an attempt to impose rational order and consistent principles across a vast and diverse population. The shamans and spiritual authorities of the various conquered tribes presented a potential challenge to Genghis Khan's authority, as they possessed considerable influence over their peoples. Genghis Khan's handling of this issue was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than attempting to suppress shamanic practice entirely, which would have been both impractical and deeply unpopular, he instead positioned himself as the supreme spiritual authority, claiming that his success in unifying the steppe and his extraordinary military victories demonstrated heaven's favor. The removal of Kokichu, while presented as necessary for the stability of the imperial family, also served to eliminate a potential rival for spiritual authority and to consolidate Genghis Khan's position as the Tengrist leader, the Khan chosen and blessed by eternal blue heaven. By 1210, Genghis Khan's position on the steppe appeared secure. No rival power of comparable strength remained to challenge him. The various tribes and peoples that had once contended with one another for pasturage and plunder had been brought under a single authority. Yet this consolidation of power on the steppe, remarkable as it was, remained regional in scope. The real test of Genghis Khan's genius would come in the campaigns against the Jin dynasty and other neighboring powers. Campaigns that would transform him from a steppe conqueror into a world historical figure. The foundation for these extraordinary undertakings had been carefully laid during these years of consolidation through the creation of administrative systems, the development of military organization, and the cultivation of a personal following bound by ties of loyalty that transcended the old tribal structures. The Mongolia that existed in 1210 bore little resemblance to the chaotic, faction-ridden collection of tribes that had existed a generation earlier. It had been remade in the image of one man's will and vision, and it was ready for the greater conquests that lay ahead. Conquests and Empire. Chapter 3. Conquests and Empire. By 1210, Genghis Khan's position on the steppe appeared secure. No rival power of comparable strength remained to challenge him. The various tribes and peoples that had once contended with one another for pasturage and plunder had been brought under a single authority. Yet this consolidation of power on the steppe, remarkable as it was, remained regional in scope. The real test of Genghis Khan's genius would come in the campaigns against the Jin dynasty and other neighboring powers, campaigns that would transform him from a steppe conqueror into a world historical figure. The foundation for these extraordinary undertakings had been carefully laid during these years of consolidation through the creation of administrative systems, the development of military organization, and the cultivation of a personal following bound by ties of loyalty that transcended the old tribal structures. The Mongolia that existed in 1210 bore little resemblance to the chaotic, faction-ridden collection of tribes that had existed a generation earlier. It had been remade in the image of one man's will and vision, and it was ready for the greater conquests that lay ahead. The path to this transformation had begun years before, in 1204, in a series of decisive victories that had consolidated the chieftain Temujin's supremacy on the steppe. The defeat of Togrul Khan and his son Sengum marked a turning point, one that revealed how deeply Genghis Khan understood the power of kinship and alliance. When Togrul was killed by a Naiman warrior who did not recognize him in flight. It seemed a small matter, but Genghis Khan perceived in this moment an opportunity. He moved swiftly to absorb the Kerit elite into his own tribe, binding them not through conquest alone, but through the intimate bonds of marriage. He took the princess Ibaka as a wife and arranged for her sister Sorgatani and niece Docus to marry his youngest son, Tului. These were not mere diplomatic gestures. They were the knitting together of peoples, the creation of familial ties that would hold through the centuries to come. The Kerit, who had once stood apart, were now woven into the very fabric of Genghis Khan's emerging power. The Naimans, their ranks swelled by the arrival of Jamuka and others who had been defeated elsewhere, prepared themselves for war. It was a measure of Genghis Khan's emerging strength that he learned of their preparations not through spies alone, but through the voluntary intelligence of Alakush, the sympathetic ruler of the Omgud tribe. This too was a relationship, though of a different character, not kinship, but trust earned through demonstrated respect and shared interest. In May 1204, at the Battle of Chakimalt in the Altai Mountains, the Naimans were decisively defeated. Tayang Khan, their leader, was killed in the fighting. His son Kuklug was forced to flee westward, a fugitive who would later cause trouble in distant Central Asia, yet for now posed no immediate threat. That same year, the Merkits were decimated by Mongol armies. Jamuka, who had abandoned the Naimans at Chakimalt, was betrayed to Temujin by companions who were executed for their disloyalty. The secret history records one account in which Jamuka convinced his childhood Anda to execute him honorably. Other accounts, less clear and more brutal, speak of death by dismemberment. The childhood friendship between the two men had long since curdled into enmity, yet even in his final moments, the bond between them, or the memory of it, seemed to matter. Now sole ruler of the steppe, Temujin held in 1206 a large assembly called a Kurultai at the source of the Onon River. This gathering was no mere ceremonial occasion. It was the public articulation of a new order. Here, he formally adopted the title Genghis Khan. The meaning of this name has been much debated by those who came after. Some commentators hold that the title had no meaning, merely representing Temujin's deliberate rejection of the traditional Gurkhan title, which had been accorded to Jamuka and was thus of lesser worth in his eyes. Another theory suggests that the word Genghis bears connotations of strength, firmness, hardness, or righteousness, qualities that a leader might wish to embody. A third hypothesis proposes that the title is related to the Turkic word Tengiz, meaning ocean, so that Genghis Khan would signify master of the ocean, and as the ocean was believed to surround the earth, the title thus ultimately implied universal ruler. In this reading, the name itself was a prophecy, written into language. What followed was what one historian has termed a social revolution, a deliberate, systematic dismantling of the old ways. Genghis Khan perceived clearly what others had not, that the traditional tribal systems, which had evolved over generations to benefit small clans and families, were unsuitable as the foundations for larger states. These same systems had been the downfall of previous steppe confederations, fragmenting under their own internal contradictions. Genghis thus began a series of administrative reforms designed to suppress the power of tribal affiliations and to replace them with unconditional loyalty to the Khan and the ruling family. He was fortunate in one respect. Most of the traditional tribal leaders had been killed during his rise to power, leaving him free to reconstruct the Mongol social hierarchy according to his vision. The new order was hierarchical, but also, in its own way, novel. The highest tier was occupied solely by his and his brothers' families, who became known as the Altan Uruk, the Golden Family, or by another name, the Hagan Yasun, the White Bone. These were not merely aristocrats, they were the foundation of authority itself. Underneath them came the Kara Yasun, the Black Bone, composed of the surviving pre-empire aristocracy and the most important of the new families. This second rank was crucial, for it preserved certain elements of the old order while subordinating them entirely to the new. The careful balance suggested that Genghis Khan understood complete obliteration breeds resentment, while calculated preservation, accompanied by clear subordination, can transform former rivals into invested stakeholders. To break any remaining concept of tribal loyalty, Genghis Khan reorganized Mongol society into a military decimal system of remarkable efficiency. Every man between the age of 15 and 70 was conscripted into a minkan, a unit of 1,000 soldiers. Each minkan was further subdivided into units of hundreds, called jagan, and units of tens, called arban. What was distinctive, what revealed the depth of Genghis Khan's ambition, was that the units encompassed not merely the soldiers themselves, but each man's entire household. Thus, each military minkan was supported by a minkan of households, a pairing that one historian has aptly termed a military-industrial complex. Each minkan functioned simultaneously as a political and a social unit. Warriors of defeated tribes were deliberately dispersed to different minkan, scattered across the new realm in such a way that it became difficult for them to rebel as a single body. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was strategy of a high order, intended to ensure the disappearance of old tribal identities, replacing them with loyalty to the great Mongol state and to commanders who had gained their rank through merit and loyalty to the Khan. This particular reform proved extraordinarily effective, so effective that it would outlast empires. Even after the Mongol Empire itself was divided among Genghis Khan's descendants, fragmentation never happened along tribal lines. Instead, the descendants of Genghis continued to reign unchallenged in their respective domains, in some cases until as late as the 1700s. Even powerful non-imperial dynasts who would rise to prominence were compelled to rule from behind a puppet ruler of Genghis Khan's lineage. The system had created something almost unprecedented, a form of legitimacy so deeply rooted in a single family that no amount of geographic distance or political divergence could wholly dissolve it. To lead this reorganized realm, Genghis Khan depended upon a circle of senior companions, men known as his enkod, or trusted followers. These men were appointed to the highest ranks and received the greatest honors. Ba'orshu and Mukali, two of the most prominent, were each given command of 10,000 men. Ba'orshu leading the right wing of the army and Mukali the left. The other enkod were each given command of one of the 95 remaining minkad, a distribution of power that ensured no single commander could challenge the Khan's authority. What was remarkable about these appointments was the meritocratic principle they embodied. Many of these men were born to low social status. Rachnevsky, a historian who studied these commanders closely, noted that among them were Jelmi and Subutai, the sons of blacksmiths, along with a carpenter, a shepherd, and even 2 herdsmen who had warned Temujin of Togrul's plans back in 1203. That a blacksmith's son could rise to command thousands of warriors, that a shepherd could become a general, this was revolutionary. It suggested that in Genghis Khan's vision of order, birth mattered less than loyalty and capability. Yet even here, Genghis Khan made exceptions that revealed his understanding of human nature. Certain loyal commanders were allowed to retain the tribal identities of their units, a privilege granted selectively. Alakush of the Ongud, for instance, who had been so helpful in providing intelligence, was allowed to retain 5,000 warriors of his tribe. The reason was both practical and honorific. His son had entered into an alliance pact with Genghis Khan, marrying his daughter Alaka. The marriage bound the families together. The permission to maintain tribal identity was a mark of respect for that binding. Central to the functioning of this new state was an institution that Genghis Khan both inherited and transformed: the Kashig, or bodyguard. After Temujin had defeated Togrul in 1203, he had appropriated this Kharit institution, but in a minor form. At the 1206 Kurultai, its numbers were greatly expanded, swelling from 1,150 to 10,000 men. The Kashig was far more than a mere protective force. It was the Khan's household staff, a military academy where young men of talent could be trained, and the very center of governmental administration. All the warriors in this elite corps were brothers or sons of military commanders, essentially hostages held to ensure the loyalty of their relatives. Yet the Kashig members were not treated as prisoners. They received special privileges and direct access to the Khan, serving him and being served by him in turn. Genghis Khan evaluated their capabilities personally, assessing their potential to govern or to command their own forces. Commanders of renown, Subutai, Chulmakan, Baiju, all began their careers in the Kashig before being given independent command. It was a system of cultivation and testing, a way of identifying and developing talent, while simultaneously ensuring that future leaders understood the inner workings of power. Between 1204 and 1209, Genghis Khan was predominantly focused on consolidating and maintaining this new nation he had created. The work was not merely administrative, it was deeply personal and sometimes bitter. He faced a challenge from a man named Kokechu, a shaman whose father Minglig had been allowed to marry Helm, Genghis Khan's mother, after he had defected to Temujin. Kokechu was possessed of considerable spiritual authority and had proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan himself. He had taken the Tengrist title Teb Tengri, Holy Heavenly, on account of his powers of sorcery. He wielded influence among the Mongol commoners and, more dangerously, he sought to divide the imperial family from within. His first target was Kasar, Genghis Khan's brother, a man who had always been distrusted by his elder brother. Kokechu brought false charges against Kasar, humiliating him and nearly having him imprisoned. Yet Helm, the mother, intervened. She stepped forward publicly and reprimanded her son Genghis Khan for listening to the shaman's lies. The scene itself is remarkable. The mother defending the brother, calling her son to account, the bonds of family asserting themselves against the machinery of state authority. But Kokechu's influence was not easily contained. His power steadily increased, and he grew emboldened in his actions. When Tenji, Genghis Khan's youngest brother, attempted to intervene against him, Kokechu publicly shamed him, a humiliation that struck at the heart of the imperial family's prestige. Bertie, Genghis Khan's principal wife, watched this unfolding with growing alarm. She understood, perhaps better than her husband, that Kokechu represented a genuine threat to his power. Though Genghis Khan still revered the shaman superstitiously, the old beliefs died hard. Bertie made clear to him the political danger. It was she who warned him, who brought him to see that the shaman's spiritual authority was being wielded as a political weapon. Genghis Khan, convinced, allowed his youngest brother Tenji to arrange Kokechu's death. The shaman was removed, and then Genghis Khan usurped his position, claiming for himself the role of the Mongols' highest spiritual authority. The consolidation of power was complete, not only political and military, but spiritual as well. During these same years, the Mongols were extending their control over the territories that surrounded them. The expansion occurred systematically, almost methodically, as if Genghis Khan were drawing a circle around himself that grew larger year by year. In 1207, Genghis Khan appointed a man named Jochi, his eldest son, to command an expedition northward to subjugate the Hoi Yin Irgun, a collection of tribes living on the edge of the Siberian taiga. Under Jochi's direction, the Mongols secured a marriage alliance with the Oirats and defeated the Yenisei Kyrgyz, bringing them under Mongol authority. With this conquest came control over the region's most valuable assets, the trade in grain and furs, and its gold mines. These resources flowed back to the Mongol heartland, enriching the Khan's treasury and rewarding his followers. Westward, Mongol armies moved with equal determination. In late 1208, they defeated the Naiman-Merkit alliance on the river Irtish. The Khan of the Naimans was killed in the fighting, and Kuklug, the Naiman prince who had survived the 1204 battle at Chakimout, was forced to flee once more, this time into Central Asia. In 1211, even the Uyghurs, a sedentary people with a long history of civilization, recognized the writing on the horizon. Led by Barchuk, they freed themselves from the suzerainty of the Kara Kitai and pledged themselves to Genghis Khan. The Uyghurs were the first sedentary society to submit voluntarily to Mongol rule, an act that was as symbolic as it was practical. It suggested that the Mongol conquest was not merely the triumph of pastoral warriors over their own kind, but something larger, the drawing of diverse peoples under a single authority. Even as Genghis Khan was consolidating his power in Mongolia proper, he was also testing his strength against the settled kingdoms that bordered his realm. The Tangut-led Western Sia kingdom, which lay to the south and east, had become a target of Mongol raids. These raids had begun in 1205, ostensibly in retaliation for the Shia providing refuge to Sengum, Togrul Khan's son. But there were more prosaic explanations as well. The need to rejuvenate the depleted Mongol economy with an influx of fresh goods and livestock, or simply the desire to subjugate a semi-hostile state and eliminate a potential threat to the nascent Mongol nation. The Sia kingdom was vulnerable in a way that few peoples understood. Most of its troops were stationed along the southern and eastern borders, where they stood guard against attacks from the Song and Jin dynasties respectively. The northern border, facing the Gobi Desert and the steppes beyond, relied only on that empty expanse for protection. It was a weakness that Genghis Khan had perceived clearly. In 1207, a Mongol raid sacked the Sia fortress of Wulahai, but Genghis Khan was not content with mere raiding. In 1209, he decided to personally lead a full-scale invasion. Wulahai was captured again in May, and the Mongol armies advanced on the capital Zhongxing, known in later times as Yinchuan. But the campaign did not proceed as smoothly as it might have. The Mongols suffered a reverse against a Shia army arrayed to defend the capital. What followed was a 2-month stalemate, a grinding deadlock between armies that neither side seemed able to break decisively. It was here that Genghis Khan's tactical brilliance asserted itself. He executed a feigned retreat, a maneuver designed to deceive his opponents. The Sia forces, believing the Mongols to be in flight, abandoned their defensive positions. They were caught in the open, overpowered, and routed. Although Zhongxing was now largely undefended, The Mongols faced a problem that would plague them for years to come. They lacked the equipment necessary to conduct formal sieges. Their battering rams were crude affairs, no match for the fortifications of a settled kingdom's capital. The siege stalled. The Xia, desperate, requested aid from the Jin dynasty to the east, but Emperor Zhangzong of the Jin rejected the plea. Genghis Khan, perceiving that direct assault would not succeed, attempted a different strategy. He sought to redirect the Yellow River, the great river that flowed near the city, into Zhongjing itself, using a dam to divert its waters. Initially, the plan worked, but the earthworks, poorly constructed, or perhaps deliberately breached by the Xia defenders, broke in January 1210. The Mongol camp was flooded, and the army was forced to retreat in disorder. Yet from this apparent failure came negotiation, and from negotiation came resolution. A peace treaty was soon formalized between Genghis Khan and the Xia. The Xia Emperor Shangzong submitted and acknowledged Mongol supremacy. He handed over tribute, goods, treasure, and recognition of his subordinate status, including his daughter Chaka, a princess whose marriage to Genghis Khan's court would bind the two powers together. In exchange, the Mongol forces withdrew. The campaign had not ended in total conquest, but it had resulted in the subjugation of the Xia kingdom to Mongol authority. It was a lesson that Genghis Khan would carry forward. Even when direct assault fails, there are other paths to victory. Zed, that his son Tolui's forces were still engaged in Khorasan, and he decided instead to head northeastwards back to Mongolia. He left his youngest son in Central Asia to complete the destruction of the Khwarezmian remnants, while he himself began the long journey homeward with the bulk of his army in 1222. The return march was itself a conquest of sorts, as Mongol forces subdued the peoples they encountered along the route, further extending the already vast territorial reach of the empire. The years between 1222 and 1227 saw Genghis Khan increasingly preoccupied with securing the stability of his new dominions and with managing the complex administration of territories that now stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. Yet even as he consolidated these enormous gains, his attention was drawn once more toward China. The Jin dynasty, though weakened by plague, war, and internal corruption, remained an unfinished task in his strategic vision. He had left Mukhali to prosecute the war in the north, and that capable commander had done his work well. But the dynasty itself persisted, and Genghis was not a man to leave matters unresolved. In 1223, Mukhali died, depriving Genghis of one of his most trusted and able generals. The loss was significant, as Mukhali had managed the complex Chinese campaign with skill and brutality in equal measure, securing victories that had fragmented Jin power and brought northern China under Mongol sway. Yet his death did not halt the momentum of the Mongol advance. Other commanders, trained in Mukhali's methods and inspired by his successes, continued the work of subjugation and conquest. The Jin, internally divided and exhausted, could offer only fragmentary resistance. The Western Xia kingdom, that region Genghis had first invaded in 1209, and which had submitted through treaty rather than total conquest, now presented a different sort of problem. The Tangut rulers had maintained their nominal independence and their tributary status, but as Genghis's power grew and his ambitions expanded, their position became increasingly precarious. They had not submitted of their own will born from genuine fear, but rather through circumstance and negotiation. As the Mongol Empire matured and Genghis grew more confident of his absolute authority, Such partial submissions seemed less satisfactory. The idea of bringing the Western Seer fully and finally under Mongol control took on a renewed urgency. Beyond these immediate concerns lay questions of succession and the future of the empire itself. Genghis Khan had multiple sons: Jochi, Chagatai, Gede, and Tolui, each of whom had proven himself capable in warfare and administration. The matter of which would succeed him, and how the vast empire would be divided among them, weighed upon the aging Khan. The Kurultai that had elevated him to his position of supreme authority had been an assembly of equals, or near equals, who had chosen to follow him. But his sons were princes of the blood, and the nature of succession in Mongol custom was not entirely fixed. These were political questions that demanded resolution, and they would colour the final years of Genghis Khan's life. The relationship between Genghis and his eldest son Jochi had long been marked by tension and uncertainty. There had always been questions about Jochi's paternity, questions that Genghis himself may have harboured, though they were never made entirely explicit. Jochi had proven himself militarily capable, but the whispers of doubt that surrounded him created an awkwardness in their relationship and a wariness on Jochi's part. Some of the Khan's closest advisors questioned whether Jochi could be trusted with a position of supreme authority, and these doubts would not be fully resolved before Genghis's death. Chagatai, the second son, was known for his conservatism and his fierce devotion to Mongol law and custom. He was respected for his integrity and his unwillingness to bend to pressure, even from his father. Gede, the third son, was perhaps the most diplomatic and was known for his ability to command loyalty from those around him. He had distinguished himself in the campaigns against Khwarezmia and had shown considerable skill in both military and administrative matters. Tolui, the youngest, had proven himself a fierce and capable warrior, particularly in the brutal campaigns of Central Asia. These were the men who would shape the future of the Mongol Empire after Genghis Khan's death, though that moment was not yet at hand. In the years between 1222 and 1227, the old Khan continued to govern and to expand his dominions, ever pushing outward, ever seeking to extend his control over new lands and peoples. The empire he had created was already the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever known, yet still it seemed not to be enough. The momentum of conquest had become almost inexorable, driven by the logic of Mongol military superiority and by Genghis Khan's own ambitions and need to continually justify his authority through victory. It was during these final years that the Western seer, sensing perhaps a change in Genghis's temperament, moved to consolidate their own position and distance themselves from Mongol overlordship. They may have believed that the Mongol ruler, aging and increasingly focused on Central Asia and his Western campaigns, might have lost interest in their kingdom. If such was their calculation, it proved to be a grave miscalculation. In 1226, Genghis Khan launched what would be his final major campaign, turning his attention once more toward the Western Seer and toward the completion of a task that had been left unfinished for nearly 2 decades. Final Campaigns. Chapter 4. Final Campaigns, the years that stretched between 1222 and 1227, were years of gathering shadow, though none could have seen it so at the time. Genghis Khan had returned from the western reaches of his conquests, from the cities of Ash and the territories folded into his dominion, and he turned his aging eyes once more toward the lands he had already touched. The empire that lay beneath his hand was already immense, the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever known. Yet the logic of what he had built seemed to demand perpetual expansion. To cease moving was, in some sense, to begin dying. Victory had become not merely a means but a rhythm, the heartbeat by which he measured his own remaining years. It was during this period that the Western seer, that kingdom to the south, began to read the signs differently. They perceived, perhaps, something in the way the old Khan's attention had turned westward towards Central Asia, something in the reports of his lengthening absences, and they believed, or allowed themselves to believe, that his grip on them might be loosening. The historians remain uncertain of the precise calculation that moved them, but the records suggest competing accounts. Some sources indicate that the Western seer had been unhelpful during the earlier campaigns, declining to send the auxiliaries Genghis had requested for his invasion of Khwarezmia in 1219. Others record that they had fought alongside Mukhali, that capable general left behind in China, until his death in 1223, and that only then, sensing an opportunity when Genghis was distant and his armies engaged elsewhere, did they withdraw their cooperation and move toward independence. The truth may have contained elements of both stories, for such matters rarely cleave cleanly into singular causes. What is certain is that Genghis Khan, for all his years and all his distance, took notice. The thought that a kingdom under his sovereignty might presume to slip from his grasp was intolerable to him. Yet in his response, there came first an attempt at resolution by other means. He sought to settle the matter through negotiation, through the exchange of hostages and the re-establishment of formal bonds. It was a path that suggested either patience or calculation, or perhaps the weariness of a man who had spent decades at war and understood its cost in ways the young princes around him could not fully comprehend. But the seer elite, whether through stubbornness or miscalculation, could not agree on the hostages they would send. The Khan's patience, already strained, gave way entirely. In early 1225, having crossed the long distances that separated him from Mongolia, Genghis Khan settled himself in the heartland once more. That year was spent in preparation, in the gathering of forces and the ordering of his will. The campaigns in Central Asia had consumed much. They had tested the reach of his armies, expanded his territories, and left in their wake both the seeds of lasting authority and the profound wreckage of destroyed civilizations. The great siege of Gurganj, that terrible winter, had lasted long and demanded much from the men who conducted it. The cities of Khorasan, Nishapur and Merv and Herat, among the greatest and wealthiest cities in all the world, had been methodically annihilated under the command of his youngest son Tolui, establishing a reputation for ruthlessness that would echo through centuries. Contemporary chroniclers spoke of death tolls so vast they seemed beyond the measure of human counting. Modern scholars regard such numbers with suspicion, yet even the most conservative estimates place the catastrophe at numbers that still strike the imagination as almost inconceivable. But that was behind him now, and the empire had been divided into administrative regions, with Daragachi and Baskak appointed to govern the conquered territories and restore them to something approaching order. During his long return journey eastward, Genghis had also encountered the Taoist patriarch Changchen in the high reaches of the Hindu Kush mountains, and he had listened attentively to the teachings offered him. There was something in the Aid Khan that still attended to matters beyond conquest, still made space for philosophy and belief, still granted privileges and authority to those whose wisdom he valued. He granted the Taoists significant powers within his empire, tax exemptions, authority over monks throughout his domains, gifts that would later prove troublesome as the favored sect attempted to advance its claims over Buddhism. Yet these were intervals in a life whose essential motion remained outward, onward, toward the completion of unfinished business. And as the year 1225 turned toward 1226, that unfinished business called to him with increasing urgency. In the first months of 1226, the campaign against the Western Seer commenced. The armies moved toward Karakoto on the Shia's western border, and the city fell before them. The invasion proceeded with the momentum that Mongol forces had come to exemplify, rapid, overwhelming, and devastating in its efficiency. One by one, the cities of the Gansu corridor were sacked in an ordered succession. Mercy extended only rarely, and only where the Khan deemed it wise. The Mongol cavalry swept through the region like wind through a landscape, and by autumn, the great Yellow River lay behind them. In November of that year, the Mongols brought their siege to bear on Lingwu, a city that lay merely 30 kilometers south of Zhongxing, the Xia capital itself. The relief army that the seer sent forth to break the siege was decisively defeated on the 4th day of December, and the Khan's forces, his generals and his commanders, pressed forward to complete the investment of the city. Yet something else was happening during these months, something that no battle or siege could be arranged to prevent. In the winter between 1226 and 1227, while the campaign was still unfolding, while his generals urged the completion of victory, Genghis Khan fell from his horse while hunting. The fall itself might have been insignificant. Such accidents were common among men who spent their lives in the saddle. But in the weeks and months that followed, illness took hold of him. His strength, which had seemed inexhaustible to those who had served under him for decades, began to drain away. The sickness settled into him like a winter that would not release its grip. His sons and his commanders, watching him decline, urged him to abandon the campaign and return to Mongolia, to rest and recover. The seer, they argued reasonably, would still be there another year. They could be defeated whenever the Khan regained his health. But Genghis Khan was not a man to retreat, not from anything, not at any stage of his life. The Western seer had insulted him through their defiance. Their leading commander had offered him indignities that burned in his mind more sharply than any fever that burned in his body. He would not leave the siege incomplete. He insisted that the forces continue, that the walls be pressed, that the capital fall. His will, diminished by sickness though his flesh might be, remained absolute. His sons and his generals, for all their concern and all their reasonable counsel, could not stand against the force of his determination. The siege continued, and as autumn turned toward winter, and winter deepened into the following year, the illness itself deepened as well, becoming something from which there would be no return. In the winter of 1226, and into the following year, the siege of Zhongxing pressed forward with relentless momentum, though the pace had become constrained by forces beyond the control of generals or strategy. Genghis Khan, in the grip of an illness whose true nature would remain disputed by those who came after him, nonetheless maintained his authority over the vast encampment surrounding the Xia capital. The malady that had begun with his fall from his horse during hunting now deepened, settling into him with the kind of persistence that suggested it would not be easily dislodged. Those around him could observe the change. The Khan, who had seemed almost invulnerable through decades of campaign and conquest, now moved with visible effort, his energy rationed in ways it had not been before. The physicians attending him offered what remedies they could, drawing upon the medical knowledge of the many lands that had come under Mongol dominion. Yet illness respects no hierarchy, and the Khan's body, worn by years of hardship and exposure to climates from the steppes to the deserts, seemed increasingly resistant to recovery. His sons watched him with expressions that blended concern and calculation. Tolui, his youngest son, stood near his father throughout this period, as did Gede, observing the transformation that age and sickness were working upon the man who had built an empire through the force of his will alone. The other commanders, too, men like Subutai, who had ridden at the Khan's side for most of his adult life, could not disguise the gravity they perceived in his condition. The situation at Zhongxing itself remained in a state of siege, though not one characterized by the kind of decisive assault that might have brought rapid conclusion. The city walls stood formidable, and the population within, now aware that the Mongol Khan himself was present before them, steeled themselves for what they believed would come. Yet the rhythm of the siege had altered. Where there might have been constant pressure, there was now an almost measured quality to the operations. The generals directing the assault faced an unusual constraint. Their supreme commander, though technically still in authority, could not ride at the head of charges or direct movements with the vigor that had characterized so many previous campaigns. Some accounts suggest that Genghis left increasing portions of the siege operations to his subordinates while he remained in his jur, though the exact details of this arrangement remain somewhat obscured by the distance of centuries. It was during this period that a seer commander, whose name has been preserved in some sources though the specifics of his affront have been recorded with varying emphasis, offered what Genghis Khan construed as an insult. The exact nature of this offense, whether it was words spoken during negotiations, a symbolic gesture, or some other form of defiance, seemed to matter less than the Khan's interpretation of it. What is clear is that the injury, whether real or perceived, kindled in Genghis a determination that transcended even the physical limitations his body was imposing upon him. He had never been a man to accept disrespect, and age and sickness would not change this fundamental aspect of his character. The offense became, in his mind, something that demanded resolution before any other consideration could be entertained. Thus, when his sons and his commanders urged him to abandon the campaign, their counsel, however sensible and however deeply felt, fell upon ears that were closed to such reasoning. They presented practical arguments. The Shia would indeed remain in existence if the siege were lifted. They could be defeated in another year when the Khan had recovered his health and his strength. The waiting would not be indefinite, merely deferred to a more opportune moment. The empire would lose nothing by such a delay, and the Khan might well gain much through rest and recovery. Surely, they suggested, the conquest would come in due course, and it would be more easily achieved by a leader restored to full vigor. Yet this calculus of reason could not overcome the determination that burned in Genghis Khan, even as fever burned in his body. The two seemed almost to feed each other, the physical illness feeding into a kind of psychological intensity that would not be denied. He had spent his entire life overcoming obstacles through will and persistence. He had fashioned a nation out of scattered tribes through the same qualities. He had conquered empires through sheer refusal to accept defeat or to yield ground. He would not begin now to retreat, to pause, to compromise with circumstances. The siege would continue. The seer capital would fall. The commander who had offered him indignity would face whatever consequence Genghis determined was appropriate. The months wore on into the winter of 1226, and then into early 1227, the campaigning season extending into months when such operations were typically suspended. The cold of the season, combined with the strain of the siege operations, bore heavily upon the Mongol army as well. The supplies that had been gathered during the autumn would eventually diminish. The horses, Even the hardy Mongol mounts suffered under the prolonged hardship. The soldiers, however disciplined and however accustomed to hardship, grew weary. Yet still the siege continued, because the Khan who commanded them remained unwilling to lift it. The sources preserve some record of the state of affairs within the city as well. The inhabitants of Zhongxing, knowing that the Mongol army surrounded them, could not have been unaware that their fate hung in the balance. They were defended by walls and the hope that relief forces might come, or that the siege might eventually break of its own accord if the attackers grew tired or hungry. Yet they also knew that they faced an enemy whose reputation for ruthlessness was not undeserved. The besieged are often cast into a peculiar form of desperation, and the inhabitants of this capital city were not exempt from the psychological toll that such circumstances impose. The exact sequence of events in these final weeks and months remains subject to some ambiguity in the historical record. What is certain is that Genghis Khan's condition continued to deteriorate even as the siege pressed forward. The illness that had begun with his fall from his horse months earlier had not weakened in its grip, but rather tightened it, consuming his strength more thoroughly as time passed. Those around him could perceive that he was moving toward some final threshold, though the exact timing of it remained uncertain. Some days were better than others. Some days his mind remained clear, and his authority remained absolute, while other days saw the illness more prominently displayed. The Khan's decisions during this period, made from what was likely a sickbed, or from an encampment where his movement was increasingly restricted, continued to carry the weight of absolute command. Such was the nature of Mongol rule, and such was the force of Genghis Khan's personality, that even in evident decline, his word remained law. If he commanded that the siege continue, the siege would continue. If he determined that a particular approach should be taken, that approach would be taken. The apparatus of command that he had constructed proved sufficiently sturdy that it could function even when its supreme authority was diminished by physical affliction. The Shia, unaware of the true depth of the Khan's illness, or perhaps aware of it, but unable to believe that it would cause him to lift the siege, remained trapped within their city. Their leaders made what preparations they could for either eventual surrender or a final defense. They sent out no successful relief forces, mounted no successful breakout, achieved no negotiated settlement that might have altered the grim trajectory toward which events seemed to be moving. The stalemate of the siege, if stalemate it was, continued through the winter months and into the season when spring would gradually give way to summer. And through it all, in his jur, or perhaps in whatever structure had been prepared for him within the siege camp, Genghis Khan lay increasingly ill, his breathing perhaps becoming more labored, his appetite diminishing, his energy consumed by the effort of maintaining the biological functions that all living creatures must maintain. The sickness that had settled into him like an unwelcome winter showed no sign of releasing its grip. If anything, each passing week seemed to draw it deeper into his being, making it ever more a part of him, until it became difficult to distinguish where the illness ended and where the man himself began. A controversial legacy. Chapter 5. A controversial legacy. The body of Genghis Khan was honored with 3 days of offerings and the sacrifice of 30 maidens. In the encampment near the besieged city, where winter's grip had only recently loosened and spring began its slow arrival, this rite was observed with the solemnity befitting a man who had reshaped the world according to his will. Yet even in death, questions attended him, questions about where he would rest, about how the vast mechanism of his empire would continue without him, about which of his sons would inherit not merely lands, but the terrible weight of command itself. Rachnevsky, the historian who would study these events centuries later, theorized that the Mongols, who possessed no knowledge of embalming techniques, may have chosen to bury their Khan in the Ordos rather than risk his body decomposing in the summer heat during the long journey back to Mongolia. It was a practical consideration, born of the realities of climate and geography, the sort of detail that separates the living world from the realm of myth. Atwood, another scholar, rejected this hypothesis entirely, leaving the question suspended between possibility and uncertainty, much as the empire itself hung, suspended between one reign and another. What remained undisputed was the gravity of the moment. The man who had unified the scattered tribes of the Mongol steppe, who had forged from them an instrument of conquest that had humbled kingdoms and leveled cities, was gone. The machinery he had built, so carefully constructed, so deliberately designed to prevent the fracturing that had plagued the steppe for generations, would now face its first true test. For the tribes of the Mongol plateau had no fixed system of succession. There existed no prescribed pathway, no established law that said the eldest son must inherit, or the youngest, or the wisest. Instead, the custom that had long prevailed among the steppe peoples was a form of ultimogeniture, the succession of the youngest son, chosen because a younger man would have had less time to gather a following, would need more desperately the resources of his father's inheritance. Yet even this principle, practical as it was, applied only to property and chattels, not to titles, not to the authority that crowned a man Khan. The secret history, that primary repository of Mongol memory, recorded that Genghis had made his choice while preparing for the great Khwarezmian campaigns in 1219, years before the present moment. Rashid al-Din, the Persian chronicler, offered a different account, suggesting that the decision came before Genghis's final campaign against the Seer, placing it earlier still in the sequence of events. Regardless of which date proved accurate, and historians would debate this as they debated so much else, the choice had been made. What remained was for the living to honor it. 5 candidates had been possible. 4 were Genghis's sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Gidey, and Tolui. The 5th was Tenji, the youngest brother, who carried the weakest claim and was never seriously considered by anyone, despite the old ways that might have suggested his age as an advantage. Yet the absence of his name from meaningful consideration spoke to deeper currents within the family, to preferences and bonds that transcended custom. Jochi, the eldest son, had been born around 1182, shortly after Bertie's kidnapping by the Tatars. This circumstance of his birth cast a shadow across his life that would never fully lift. His paternity was suspect, the chronicles record, and while Temjin, who would become Genghis Khan, had accepted his legitimacy formally, the uncertainty had never been entirely dispelled. More importantly, as Jochi matured and assumed control of his appanage along the Irtysh River, extending into the distant reaches of Siberia, he had grown increasingly preoccupied with his own domain. He had become, in a sense, focused on what was his, rather than on loyalty to the whole. When the siege of Gurganj had demanded his participation, when that wealthy city had needed to be taken so that it might become part of his territory, Jochi had participated only reluctantly. The hesitation itself was telling. And when booty had been divided, he had failed to return to Genghis the normal share due to the Khan, the portion that acknowledged supremacy and submission. This refusal to observe the old obligations had kindled anger in his father. The tensions between them had grown sharp enough that Genghis had begun considering sending Gidey and Chagatai to bring him to heel. to enforce compliance with family obligation. But before that confrontation could occur, before a crisis could crystallize into open conflict, news had arrived that Jochi had fallen ill. The illness had claimed him in 1223, resolving the question of his succession not through choice, but through death. Chagatai, the second son, born around 1184, had inherited an appanage in the former territories of Kara Kitai, surrounding the city of Al-Malai in Turkestan. He was, according to the record, uncompromising in his nature and arrogant in his bearing. His knowledge of Mongol legal customs was great, his respect for the old ways deep. Yet these virtues were shadowed by character flaws that his father could not overlook. Most tellingly, Chagatai had once publicly denounced his elder brother Jochi as a merkit bastard, a crude reference to the circumstances of Jochi's birth, and had brawled with him in front of Genghis himself. Such behavior, such public disrespect, and lack of restraint had convinced the Khan that his second son lacked the temperament for supreme authority. The willingness to fight family in open view suggested an inability to compromise, a narrowness of vision that would fracture rather than bind together the carefully assembled state. These qualities, combined with his obvious limitations, had effectively removed him from serious consideration. The elimination of Jochi through death and Chagatai through perceived unfitness left two brothers standing, Gede and Tolui. Tolui, the youngest son, born around 1193, was unquestionably the superior military commander. His campaign in Khorasan had broken the Khwarezmian Empire, shattering it so thoroughly that it could not recover. He possessed abilities in warfare that far exceeded those of his elder brother Gede, who had never distinguished himself as a military leader. Yet Tolui carried liabilities that proved ultimately decisive. Gede, born around 1186, was known throughout the Mongol world to drink excessively, so excessively that even by the standards of a people who drank deeply, his consumption was remarkable. This habit, the historical record suggests, eventually caused his death in 1241, years into his own reign. He was not his father's military equal, nor indeed the equal of several of his brothers. He was not, on the surface, the obvious choice. Yet Gede possessed talents that his brothers, for all their abilities, had never cultivated. He was generous with others in a way that went beyond the customary obligations of honor. He was generally well-liked, a quality that might seem small, but that Genghis had come to understand as essential to rule. Aware of his own limitations as a military commander, Gede had the wisdom to trust capable subordinates, a trait that his elder brothers lacked. Unlike them, he was willing to compromise on matters of governance, to listen to voices other than his own. Most crucially for the preservation of what Genghis had built, he was more likely than Tolui to maintain and protect Mongol traditions and customs. Tolui's wife was Sorgatani, herself a Nestorian Christian, a woman who was patron to many religions, including Islam. Through her, Tolui had been exposed to influences that, while they brought knowledge and breadth of perspective, also threatened to erode the particular character of Mongol life. The Khan, in choosing Gede, demonstrated judgment that modern historians have recognized as sound. He understood the difference between the commander who excels in war and the administrator who can sustain empire in peace. He saw in his middle son the qualities necessary not to conquer, but to preserve, to steward, to keep intact the structures that had been so painstakingly built. Beyond the choice of successor, however, lay a deeper question about the system itself. The traditions of the Mongol steppe had never demanded a fixed method of inheritance, and this absence, while it had allowed for flexibility in earlier generations, now threatened to become a source of permanent fracture. The Kurultai, that assembly of nobles and commanders, provided a forum for the collective will, yet it remained vulnerable to ambition and competing interests. When Tolui assumed the regency following his father's death, he inherited not merely administrative duties, but also a unique opportunity. The customary practices that governed a Khan's passing, the suspension of military campaigns, the extended mourning period under the regent's supervision, and the eventual convening of the Kurultai to select the successor, created a window in which alternative outcomes might have seemed possible to those with their own claims to power. Tolui's position as regent was, in theory, a place of tremendous authority. He oversaw the observance of the traditions that bound the Mongol elite together, controlling the rhythm and pace of events that would culminate in the choosing of the next Khan. And yet, for all his military prowess, for all his demonstrated ability to command armies and break empires, Tolui harbored ambitions of his own. The support of Jochi's family, a significant faction within the broader Mongol aristocracy, suggested that his candidacy for succession possessed real weight. Any Kurultai convened in the normal fashion, however, would face a constraint that no amount of regental authority could overcome. The assembled commanders and nobles, those men whom Genghis himself had elevated and honored throughout his reign, would surely remember their late Khan's wishes. They had witnessed his selection of Gede. They understood his reasoning. To defy his explicit choice would be to undermine the very principle of obedience and collective respect for the Khan that held the empire together. It appears that Tolui grasped this reality with clarity, if reluctantly. His delay in convening the Kurultai may have reflected not merely administrative caution, but a deeper awareness of the futility of his own aspirations. The sources suggest a certain hesitation on his part, a reluctance that required persuasion from others. Among those who urged him forward was Yel Chukai, an advisor of considerable influence and wisdom who had already begun to play a significant role in Mongol governance. Yel Chukai possessed the kind of perspective that came from familiarity with settled civilizations and their institutions. He understood both the power of tradition and the danger of leaving succession uncertain for too long. It was through his counsel that Tolui was finally moved to proceed with the Kurultai, setting aside whatever hopes he may have entertained for himself. When the Kurultai was at last held, in 1229, the outcome confirmed what informed observers had anticipated. Gede was crowned Khan, with Tolui in attendance. The presence of the former regent at this crowning carried its own symbolic weight. It demonstrated acceptance, even if that acceptance had not come easily. The transition was accomplished, and the empire's governance passed to the hands of the son whom Genghis had deemed most suitable for the preservation of what had been built. Yet the issue of succession, once resolved in Gede's favor, pointed toward a structural problem that would eventually tear the empire asunder. Genghis's decision to divide his lands among his sons through the appanage system, granting Jochi territories along the Irtysh River extending into Siberia, Chagatai the former Karakitai territories in Turkestan, and Gede lands in Jungaria, was conceived as a method of ensuring stability and providing each son with the means to support his position. The system reflected an understanding that the empire was too vast to be administered from a single center, and that the bonds of loyalty and family obligation would suffice to hold these disparate regions together under the supreme authority of the great Khan. Yet this same system contained within it the seeds of fragmentation. The appanages were not merely administrative districts, they were kingdoms unto themselves, with their own interests, their own revenues, and their own reasons to pursue independent policies. As time passed, and as the sons of Genghis begat sons of their own, the sense of unity that had animated the original conquest began to dissipate. The local interests of the various khanates, the Golden Horde in the west, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Levant, and the Yuan dynasty in China, gradually diverged from one another. What had been intended as a system of stable inheritance became, instead, the mechanism by which a unified empire fragmented into competing successor states. The vision of a single Mongol dominion ruled from a central authority faded into history as these khanates pursued increasingly independent courses, sometimes in cooperation with one another, but often in opposition. This development suggests that Genghis's greatest failing, as historians have observed, lay not in his conquests or even in the brutality they entailed, but rather in his inability to devise a succession system that would preserve the unity of his creation. He understood many things with remarkable clarity: the importance of loyalty, the value of meritocratic command, the need for organized governance, but the challenge of ensuring that his empire would remain whole after his death proved beyond the reach of even his vision. The appanage system seemed logical, seemed necessary given the geographical realities of his dominions, yet it ultimately served as the vehicle for the empire's dissolution. The irony is profound. Genghis had spent his entire life unifying the fragmented tribes of Mongolia, fighting against the centrifugal forces that seemed always ready to tear apart any larger political entity on the steppe. He had overcome this tendency through force of personality, through the creation of a meritocratic system that rewarded loyalty, through the establishment of law and order that transcended tribal allegiances. Yet when it came time to pass his legacy to his heirs, he could not escape the logic of inheritance that had governed the steppe for generations. The division of his lands among his sons was made inevitable not by his choice alone, but by the weight of tradition and the practical necessity of governing an empire that stretched across continents.